everyone, we're going to find the domain of each log or natural log function here, and we have 4 problems. And the main thing you need to know about logs is that when you have some log base of x, this x here has to be greater than 0. It has to be positive. If you look at the graph of your parent function, it's something like this. So for x has to be positive, and you have this asymptote here, so it never crosses that. So when you start for this first one here, g of x equals log base 2 of x plus 10, the base here doesn't really matter for this problem. All we need to know is this quantity here. We'll call this, I don't know what to call it. Let's just call it x, second x, so I'll call it x sub 2, has to be positive. So you just set this to be positive. So x plus 10 has to be positive or greater than 0. So x has to be greater than negative 10. So you subtract 10 from both sides. So your answer is x is greater than negative 10. And think about it mentally. You plug in negative 10 plus 10, you get 0. Well, it can't be 0, but we have greater than. So then plug in negative 9, and if you plug in negative 9, that works. So anything greater than negative 10 will work for the domain. And the same thing's going to happen for natural log. So the same thing, if you have natural log of x, then the x has to be positive. So we just take this quantity here and make it positive. So I'm going to add 11 to both sides, and then divide both sides by 8. So x has to be greater than 11 divided by 8. And if you plug it back in, you'll get a 0 here, but it has to be greater than that. So that's your answer for that one. Now the next two are a little more complicated. We can still do our logs here. So this x minus 2 has to be positive. So x has to be greater than 2. At the same time, when you're trying to find the domain of this whole function, we know we can't divide by 0. So you can either factor, we got to see what makes this 0. We can't have x squared minus 49 cannot equal 0, because you can't divide by 0. So you can either solve this way, take the square root of both sides. When you take the square root of both sides, don't forget to put the plus and minus. So x cannot be plus or minus 7. Or what you could have done is just factored that with your difference of squares. I just expanded that binomial, and I get x can't be 7, x cannot be negative 7, which is what we got here. So your domain is x. Well, first of all, you can write it more formally, but x has to be greater than 2, and x cannot be 7. We're not using the negative 7 because it's already restricted here that x is greater than 2. So it has to be greater than 2, everything above 2 except 7. All right, and then the last one, same thing, we can just take care of that piece. 8 minus x has to be positive. So we could say x is greater than x. Or you can rewrite this and read it backwards. X is less than 8. Now for the square root function, your domain of your square root of x, if this is your, say, your parent function, x has to be greater than or equal to 0, this whole quantity. Because you don't want to get negatives in the square root, especially if we're talking about all real numbers. However, since it's in the denominator, if you have 1 divided by some square root of x, then x cannot equal 0, because you can't divide by 0. So in this case, it's just going to be greater than 0. So for our case, we're going to take x minus 2 has to be positive. So x has to be greater than 2. And I just added 2 to both sides. So we have x has to be greater than 2 and less than 8. So that's your answer, and it's better if you write it this way. X has to be less than 8, but greater than 2. And if you want to write it more formally, that's how you would write it. And that's it. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.